Hey everybody, welcome to Weiss Advice here on YouTube. Make sure you check out the website Weiss Advice. My name is Josh from the channel Josh Richens Producer, and I have just released a cover on my channel for the song That's What I Like by Bruno Mars. Now, in my last video, we talked about the drum bus processing, and in this video, I'm going to talk about the individual tracks and the processing that I used for those. And I'm also going to talk about a few kind of experimental mindsets while mixing that I think are worthwhile, and there was some funny stuff in this track that I did. So let's get straight into it. Now, I'm not going to be playing the song in this video just so that we don't run into any copyright violations, but here is a little bit of the drum mix. And I'll start breaking down the individual tracks for you. I'm going to do all of this with my drum bus on because that's generally how I mix. I do have a top-down-ish method when I mix drums. I do like to start with my master bus at least and then kind of shape things in the master bus. But that doesn't mean I won't go backwards and forwards. It's not a hard and fast rule. So let's start off with the kick drum, and the kick drum, I already did something pretty interesting here that I don't always do. It's not super duper interesting, but it will serve a point that I want to make. So I have two different kick drum tracks here, and if I play these for you, together they sound like this. They sound, kind of like an electric sample a little bit. Obviously you can hear the bleed in there and stuff like that, but the kick sound is pretty worked so that it doesn't sound like a normal kick drum. The inspiration for that I did talk about in my last video, so I won't go over it again, but I wanted this kick to feel like a sample while still being able to make it work in the context of some of the faster fills, and that stuff can really fall apart, especially when you don't have like the natural click of a kick drum. One of these tracks does sound mostly like the click of my kick drum, and that's this one just here. But it's being mixed in with this other sound, which on its own sounds like this. Which definitely has a kind of electric feel to it. But when you mix in this kick drum sound as well, which, as you might have heard there, isn't really that compressed. There's some dynamic to it. Have another listen. Especially in some of these sections where I'm playing some doubles. And you can hear that even though I do have compression going on inside Virtual Mix Rack on this first plugin, it's mixed in pretty low. So, nothing too wild with the parallel compression on that track. While I'm here, the only other thing on this track is a transient shaper, just to get more of that click out. And then also, it looks like I added some sustain for whatever reason. It is a pretty short kick drum, so I probably did want a bit more oomph out of it. But the other thing about this, and the reason I probably don't know quite what I was doing there, is I didn't quite know what I was doing when I was mixing this kick drum. And the reason I have a mult of this kick track in the first place is because I had one version that I wasn't really happy, that I kind of like saved on a track, and then I duplicated it out so I could do some like really weird stuff but still fall back on this version. And it wasn't until I was a bit stuck and I just said, well, what do these kicks sound like together? That I started to get somewhere that I liked, and it started to like work out, even though both of those sounds from where they started changed because I was working with two kick tracks. And that brings up a point for me. I think when you're looking at people break down tracks online, much like I am here, where they just go plug in by plug in, it feels like it's almost like this perfect recipe that they had. Sprinkle of this, dash of this, and then voila, we've got, a magic mix. But a lot of times it isn't necessarily like that. I actually did a video with Matt where he interviewed me and he asked me about my production style, and I responded hard-headed. And I think this is what I'm talking about, is it doesn't always have to work, but just keep experimenting, keep trying different things, and eventually you might stumble across something that you actually really like. And so I don't think this is the best kick sound that I've ever gotten. I think it works in the mix and I'm happy with it. And I like this cover. I'm really happy with this cover. Now, with these kick drums, I did want to bring that point up more than anything, but I will run you down the processing of this kick drum really quickly because it's pretty interesting. Obviously dry, we just heard it before with the other kick track, given that this is just a copy of the first kick track. Dry sounds like this. Not the worst kick capture, but super duper mid-rangey. Definitely needs a lot of scooping. And you can see that there is a fair bit going on inside of Virtual Mix Rack over here. I've got Revival pushing a lot of top end. We're pushing a lot of top end over here. We're pushing low end and some low mid. We're pushing even more low end. This is a thing that I really like to do, where I use a resonant filter, a low cut filter at around 50 hertz or so to really push that low end. And I've done it here. We're using compression, and then I'm bringing it all back down with trimmer. So what I'll do, so that you're not just hearing a whole bunch of plugins turn on at once, is I'll just activate these one at a time for you while the kick track plays. So that's a bit more like a natural kind of a kick sound. After that, we're going into a saturation knob. This is a plugin that I just love for drums. I use it all the time. If you've seen me mixing drums on this channel, you've seen this plugin. And it's free as well. I don't know if I've mentioned that before, but go and try it out. Now, one of the funny things about saturation knob that isn't my favorite is I'm pretty sure we've been hearing it on this whole time. Because while it says off here, saturation knob doesn't bypass properly on Cubase. So let's start with saturation knob on, and I'm going to turn it off with the activate effect button, which does work. So I know there's a little skip there. We will have to put up with that just because I have to use the activate effect button. It is a little bit of a janky plugin, I do find, but hey, maybe that one's on me for using an old version of Cubase. Nonetheless, there's not too much to go over there. I really like the keep low setting just because it does give you a nice clean low end while still giving you, in all honesty, a lot of gain along with the saturation. It kind of turns things up a lot as well, and sometimes I like to use it for that. It sounds a bit funny, but it stays pretty clean all the way through here, and you can add a lot of gain and also color at the same time. And to be clear, when I say gain, I am just talking about volume. Anyway, moving on from this cursed plugin, I've got an instance of SSL EQ after that, doing even more tone shaping. This one's a pretty standard smiley face kind of thing. You can see I do have the divide by 3 button, which means we are... No, but you see, it just means I was trying lower frequencies and seeing what I could find, and eventually I left that on and came up around 900 hertz, which means, I could have hit that without using this button. It just means that we're sitting at about 306 hertz, and I definitely didn't use a calculator to figure that out. Anyway, I'll be quick with this one. We'll start with it off, turn it on, and then we'll move on. Carving away a lot of that mid-range that makes the kick drum sound like a kick drum, and just giving us a lot of like low end and top end that you'd probably get from poppy samples. And after that, we've got R-bass. Again, R-bass is nice because it kind of lengthens the low end. You saw before I was using that filter trick. Generally, I use either that filter trick or R-bass or just an EQ. And usually it's just two of those three things, and one of them is always EQ. So what I'm trying to say is I go between R-bass and the filter thing, and in rare instances like this, I use both of them. So I'll start with R-bass off and we'll turn it on. And this to me is where it really starts to, get away from an acoustic sounding drum kit. After that, I have a transient shaper. And this one's doing something kind of interesting. We're getting a lot of attack out of it, but we're also getting a lot of pump. And I have the clip button on because I'm pushing so much attack. I want to kind of stay safe. And in all honesty, I think this is where we hear most of the distortion coming from on this chain until we get to Magma Little Tube, of course. once again, I wasn't particularly scientific with that either. I was just trying things out, and if it sounded more like the kick drum I wanted, then I was leaving it on, and the transient shaper in that setting was doing what I wanted. I think in the first case, I actually wasn't using a lot of pump, and I was playing around with the sustain and not getting what I wanted. It wasn't until I turned the pump right up that I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And so I just left it that way. Now, at the end of this chain, we've got Magma Little Tube. This is a pretty cool plugin, actually. I think this got a bit of a bad rap when it came out. I know Matt's not the biggest fan, but I quite like it. I think that it sounds nice. It's just a different distortion, and at the end of the day, distortions aren't really that different, so I like it sometimes. I'll start with it off and I'll turn it on. It's giving us a little bit of gain as well, but I'm not upset at it. And so that's my kick processing. Once again, both the tracks together. I think the best way to describe it is that all of the tonal shaping in the low end and the distortion ends up layering up to have this kind of like sound inside the kick drum. I don't know if that's coming through so much, but that to me is what gives it that electric kind of feeling. Moving on from there, let's have a look at the snare drum. Snare drum was honestly a really tricky one for me. I had to do a lot to get this snare drum to work, and I had to do some really funny stuff. So I'll show you. The snare drum sounds like this. On its own, that's really not the best snare drum sound. In the mix, it works, and I was happy with everything by the end of it. And that brings up an interesting point. When you're doing covers, I've actually found sometimes the best sound is actually like a really bad one. And I figured this out when I was working with Kaiden Hertog, who's a bassist who also uploads here on YouTube. So make sure you check out his channel. He is absolutely phenomenal. And I was doing a bass cover with him, and the tone that I ended up getting sounded really good while he was playing along with the track. And we both soloed the tone out, and it was like the woofiest distortion you've ever heard on a bass guitar. It sounded really bad, but because he was really tight and playing the parts that he was given by the band, it was mixing with the sounds that were there really nicely, because they had such clean, nice bass tones already that sometimes if you just layer more of that on top of the song, it's really hard to get it to work, and it really messes with everything. Whereas if you can get something that's a bit like sketchy sounding and super different from the sounds that are already there, it actually layers in a lot nicer. So while this snare was a lot of work, I was happy with where it ended up, but where it started was honestly even worse than that. Let me show you the snare on its own. Now, this one's completely on me. I think I was doing some funny things with tuning, and honestly, after I recorded this, I realized I had a little bit of a split in my resonant head that was probably causing me to tune it up really high. Now, at the start, I don't always use in phase because I like to get my phase as good as possible, but sometimes when I'm having issues, I do reach for it. What I'm going to do for in phase is I'm just going to solo it out with the overheads, and I'm going to loop up one of these shots so that we can really hear what it's doing. Let's have a listen to this snare shot here. So you can see that honestly, really what it's doing is kind of changing the character a little bit. I was trying to fix things, and I don't think the thing at the end of the day was really the phase. I think the problem that I was having was actually much more the tuning. So it's a small difference. It does make a difference, but I think it's kind of a take it or leave it. And at the end of the day, it's a little bit negligible given that the next thing I did was play around with frequency shifting. You can really see in this video that it feels a little bit loose. And actually that's why I wanted to talk about it, is because, you know, like I said before, things can feel really scientific. And I don't want to give off that notion that everything has to be like perfectly planned out, because if that was the case, you know, you'd never be able to learn how to perfectly plan things out when you do get to those scenarios where it is just easy and you just go, oh yeah, just this, it's sounding great. Because that does happen, but not always. Now, I played around with this a lot, and at the end of the day, I was trying to find something that gave me a little bit more weight in my snare drum, because actually, just tuning a snare drum down with a frequency shifter sometimes is really cool. I've used it for some really beefy, thick snare sounds that I've been complimented on before as well. In this case, I was more so trying to like tune it with the track while also get a little bit of that beef out of it. I'll start with it off and then we'll turn it on, and I'll mute these overheads back up as well. Now, I think this one's interesting because it does mess with your phase. So it's worth doing it in the context of everything. So I'll go back and I'll start with it off and then I'll turn it on again halfway through. But this time we're listening to the whole drum mix. So it doesn't mess with things too much. And it kind of tunes it more to the track. Again, like I said, you can't necessarily hear the track in this video because I don't want to run into copyright problems. But if you want a reference, you can go and check it out on my channel. And so moving on from there, I go into Virtual Mix Rack where I'm trying out a few things that I generally do on snare drums, such as gating, maybe a little compression, maybe some tone shaping. And in this case, I actually went back, turned off the compression and the tone shaping, and it's just the gate. And I'm not even pulling everything out with the gate, I'm just turning it down. So let me start with it off and then I'll turn it on. I gotta say, I love these Slate gates. They sound so good. So while it looks like there's more going on, just a gate inside this one. Moving on from there, we have multipass. And multipass is actually where a lot of the work went on. I just wanted to get to a few things at once, and multipass had all of them in there, including some multiband distortion. And that's why I reached for it, but it was super duper useful. So I'll start with it off and then we'll turn it on halfway through and I'll talk about what's going on. It almost sounds like I'm gating it, but it's actually just the sustain being pulled down by the transient shaper at the end. It's really shortening everything else up and making it seem less apparent. Like I said, I also have some multi-band distortion here because I was trying to make up for stuff in the mix that I didn't have. I wanted some extra like top end in this snare, and the stuff that I was getting out of the snare wasn't great. And so just trying to mess with it and see if I could get something different with distortion was useful. But I didn't want to bring out all of that like stuff I didn't like that was happening in the mid-range, and I also didn't want to start compressing things too much with the distortion because it could make a lot of the ghost notes I was playing sound really bad. And you can hear there, it really shortens things up and kind of makes it a lot more like an electric sound that I've been talking about. Along with the transient shaper and the distortion, there's also a boost that is down at 144, which is worth pointing out that it's actually kind of low mids. And the reason that's worth pointing out is because while it looks like I'm doing more low-end cuts around here, it's actually, they're kind of next to each other. I do have the order of these bands a little bit mixed up. So this one over here, 300, is actually this cut at 330. And then this one over here is a little bit more boost in the same area. So 5 decibels of boost down at 114. And then I'm using this EQ to get a lot of top end out. To be honest, I'm actually pulling up the stuff that I do like so that the things I don't like sit away. So I could have probably gotten there with cutting as well, but I was more so focusing on the points that I did like, and that's why I chose to boost as opposed to like cut that really awkward stuff out. I'll start with this off and then we'll turn it on. So we're starting to actually get somewhere with this snare. It's kind of getting pretty cool. Now the next thing that I have on here is trigger, and it's a bit of an interesting one, trigger. I chose not to go with it for 2 reasons. First of all, one of them didn't necessarily sound better with it on, and so I turned it off and just worked for what I was looking for without trigger. But the second one is actually just that it brings up an interesting point about covers. Normally, I'm a huge fan of editing and samples and sample replacement and all of these modern techniques that we use to make music sound as good as it does. And the reason I feel that way is because I'm not trying to prove anything with the music that I make. I'm generally just trying to make music that I want to listen to as well. But when it comes to covers, I kind of am trying to prove something. Like, there's no need for me to go and put drums over a song that already has a full arrangement. And I'm sure that people aren't going, oh, I'm going to go and listen to this one drum cover version of the song because it sounds so much better than this fully complete song, you know, where everything in it has been shaped to work with each other and it's already mastered and all of these kinds of things. And so because of that, I kind of feel like I do have something to prove. You know, this is an exhibition of my skills as a drummer, and editing would kind of ruin that. It's an exhibition of how well I can mix drums and the drum sounds that I can get in the context of a cover, admittedly. And so I see using samples kind of similarly. It would, you know, start to cover up the drum sounds that I am trying to put on display. When I'm making a drum cover, I really want you to hear the drums that you're seeing. I don't want like some extra sample to just come out of nowhere. So an interesting point, but at the end of the day, I decided not to go with Trigger, and it sounds pretty different now, I think, to what it sounded like when I was playing around with Trigger, so it probably doesn't sound the best. I'll play a little bit of it on. Not the greatest in my opinion. So Trigger stayed off. I have another frequency shifter here that's also off. Like I said, there were crazy things happening while I was experimenting, but hey, it is what it is. That one stayed off anyway, and the last plugin that we have, again, is Fresh Air, because I was really working to get the top end that I wanted out of these drums. They weren't sounding great when I was just boosting them and doing the things I would normally do to get the sounds that I wanted. So Fresh Air came to the rescue, gave us some top end that we like. I'll start with it off and I'll turn it on. So eventually we got somewhere with the snare drum that I was pretty happy with. Once again, before and after. Now, the kick and the snare were two of the main things that I really wanted to go over, and so I'm going to kind of just touch on the other things. My side snare was the exact opposite of everything I've been talking about so far. I loved the capture, I loved how it sounded, I didn't do much. There is just a gate, an EQ, and some saturation. And without that, my side snare sounds like this. And with this, it sounds like this. You can even see that the EQ is really only just doing a little bit of top end. So it's just the hard gating and then the EQ, and then a little bit of like changing the character using the distortion as well. Really, really simple stuff on that one. And it was easy when I was doing it. It came to me really fast and I didn't have to do a lot of work there. So the toms were kind of similar, but because the kick and the snare was so bad, there was a lot of bleed in the toms that I didn't like. And when I was doing this mix, I was thinking in the back of the mind, you know, I'm probably going to end up cutting the toms. I'll come in here and I'll cut out all the silences. But before I did that, what I ended up trying was bouncing out this track here that says kick and snare, and then sending that to a set of side-chained compressors that are on all of my individual tom tracks. And so that's going to be kind of hard to show because the way that Cubase works, if I want this compressor to be going, we actually have to be listening to this track at the same time. And so it is pushing some of that stuff down in the toms, but I'm going to completely skip over the toms to talk about this track because it completely encapsulates everything I've been talking about so far with crazy experimental mixing. And that is that this track is feeding our master bus. It's going to the stereo out, meaning that it's part of our drum mix when I actually just bounced it to feed compressors. So at some point or another, I hadn't even realized that I had checked what this was giving me by just patching it to the output so I could hear the track. and then I just accidentally left it on. And when I realized and I turned it off, I didn't like what I got. So it stayed on. It might sound crazy, and in all honesty, it kind of is. There are better ways to do this. There are cleaner ways to do this. I've been experimenting with them since this. But there's no reason to chase my tail around sounds I've already got. I kind of touched on that before. And so it's a crazy one and it's experimental, but it ended up in there. And I wanted to show you that because I think it does kind of show you that sometimes this stuff isn't always like super cut and dry and scientific. So I'm going to play my entire drum mix. I'm going to leave this kick and snare track out, and then we're going to turn it on halfway through. Might be a little bit hard to hear. I'm really going to turn this up a bunch so that we can hear the difference it's making, because it actually does make a big difference. And then if I turn it off. Now, in particular, it really helped in the context of the mix. So I'm sure you can hear the difference it's making there. It really adds like this clean layer to our kick and our snare drum because everything on my drum bus was bypassed when I was bouncing this track. And so we're just getting these kick and snare sounds before they hit our drum bus put back through. It's kind of like mixing drums in reverse. Like normally you go out to a drum bus that's pretty modest and then you split out to like parallel compression and parallel distortion and all of that extra kind of stuff. But in this case, we're kind of going really hard on our drum bus and we're splitting out to parallel clean sounds. So I'm going to leave it there for this video. I think it displayed what I was talking about with this kind of messy experimental mixing, and I'm really happy with the drum mix that I got. So make sure you check out wiseadvice.com. There's a bunch of awesome courses that you can use to get better at mixing and production. And remember what we say here at Wise Advice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument. Catch you next time.